December 17, 1944. A small unarmed plane drifted over the Ardennes, and 3 minutes later, an entire German company had been erased from the map. That moment, recorded in a frozen diary, marks the instant many German soldiers understood they were no longer fighting the same war they had learned to survive on the Eastern Front. They had trained for the rhythm of Soviet barrages, ranging shots, patterns, a few spare seconds to dive, to count, to live. Here in the white hush of the Ardennes, that rhythm died. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, fingers numb from cold, wrote of silence turning to total destruction. Otto Schmidt later told of a wadi north of Tunis where a laughable piper cub floated above the sky, and 30 seconds later his company was gone. These are not tales of heroism or ideology. They are the slow, sharp records of men who lost their assumptions, and with them, many friends. What broke them was not a single miracle weapon. It was a machine of practice, metal and paper and factories, radios that carried clear voices through static, observers trained to think like infantry, and gunners at once, rooms of clerks who had already solved the math of ballistics, batteries that fired so their shells arrived together that there was no warning, and then a small device, the VT fuse, that made shallow holes deadly by exploding shells above the men who trusted the ground. Listen to their diaries and letters and reports that follow. You will hear the sound of horses dying beside guns that could not withdraw, the anger of officers who watched coordinated fire erase formations, the helplessness of men who had expected to outlast bombardment by lying flat. This story is told from the losing side because they lived the surprise and the betrayal. Stay with it, and you will understand how organized industry, simple calculation, and a new way to measure time turned artillery into something like a verdict. He had learned how to read death by sound. On the Eastern Front, shells spoke a language, an approaching whistle that lengthened, a rattling that warned of a ranged zero, the pattern of impacts that told you whether to move, to hold, to lie flat, and wait. On the morning of December 17, 1944, in the frozen hush of the Ardennes, Obergefreiter Hans Müller found that language had been stolen from him. There was no whistle. There was no warning. There was only a silence that felt like a held breath. And then the world detonated. Müller sat in a narrow slit trench, his notepad a small warmth under his mittened hand. The snow around him was fresh, the fog thick enough to swallow shapes at 10 meters. His handwriting was small, cramped from cold and fatigue. His lines read like a soldier's confession. The Americans are not like the Russians. Their artillery is something else entirely. That sentence would come to haunt him. It was not bravado, it was the bleak accounting of a man watching the rules of survival he trusted for years collapse in an instant. Across the West, German veterans arrived with Eastern Front habits burned into muscle memory. They had learned to survive Soviet barrages by listening and by timing. Ranging shots gave them seconds to scramble. Barrages came in discernible patterns that allowed brief movement. Artillery officers learned to read the sky and the earth, and to trust those readings. Now those lessons failed like a torn net. The shock was not just physical, it was cognitive. A soldier's mind is a ledger of habits. When to duck, when to move, when to close your eyes and hope. When those habits fail, anxiety becomes a tidal force. Men who had once answered with calm competence found themselves frozen by a new indecipherable threat. Survival depended no longer on old instincts, but on a system they could not see. They faced not a different shell, but a different order of war. In the hours before the barrage, Müller's battalion, part of the 6th SS Panzer Army, had pushed through the low, snow-heavy trees. Surprise had been their ally. Thinly held American positions, fog that hid movement, the brittle hope of a local victory. For a moment the old calculus seemed to work. Orders crackled down the line, companies formed, men warmed themselves on stale coffee, heated over tiny stoves. A quiet arrogance settled over the troopers, the arrogance of men who had survived worse. What broke that arrogance was speed, precision, and a terrifying coordination they could not match. The first explosions were not the rolling, widening crash the veterans knew. They were simultaneous. Airbursts and ground bursts collapsing in a single, overwhelming sound. Men had no time to react. Those who had learned to drop flat, to hug the earth and survive, were suddenly exposed to a rain of fragments falling from the sky. Foxholes became death traps, not sanctuaries. The tactic that had saved comrades in Stalingrad, in Kharkov, in the open steppes, failed in the Ardennes snow. The human detail makes the cruelty sharper. Otto Schmidt, a veteran who had fought in Tunisia and the East, later counted survivors from a company of 123 men, 11. He had watched a small plane, a dot against cold air, drift overhead and had not imagined it carried a death sentence. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, an artilleryman who had fought in Salerno, wrote after capturing American documents, "At first he thought the procedures were deception. No artillery system could perform as described," he said. Then he watched American fire obliterate guns with precision, not random saturation, and his skepticism turned into a stunned, bitter respect. These are not battlefield cliches. They are minute reports of what happens when technology and organization outpace experience. The Americans did not invent courage. They did not spy out men in foxholes and aim individually. They built a system that turned a single sighting into a coordinated, almost surgical application of force. For German soldiers, that system had an almost moral quality: invisible, impartial, inexorable. It punished patterns, not people. Inside the lines, conflicts rippled. Non-commissioned officers argued with company commanders, who insisted on pushing forward because orders demanded momentum. Men whispered about leaving positions rather than walking into visible death. In one battalion, an order to attack a house 300 meters away met with outright refusal. The men would not cross open ground, knowing that American artillery could puncture any shallow cover. Duty clashed with instinct for survival. Officers faced the terrible calculus of obedience versus responsibility for lives. The war's bureaucracy, orders, timetables, objectives, met the human body's final, simple calculation: whether to live. Emotion tightened every scene. Fear was not cinematic frenzy, but a slow, hardening logic. Men compared notes in whispered confessions: the shape of the first explosion, the smell of cordite, the way snow turned red. Later, in prisoner compounds or in half-lit tents, soldiers tried to name the sensation. Not shame exactly, but the hollow that comes when one's myths of safety are disproven. Some blamed tactics, some blamed luck. Others, stripped of ideology and pretense, blamed the fact that the enemy could simply make more iron and more shells. The small personal archives of this morning matter: diaries, pocket letters, the ink smudged by cold. They record a quieter defeat than the headlines, the defeat of expectation. Oberst Heinrich Müller, in reports later captured after being wounded, complained not of tanks or of infantry, but of artillery that seemed to watch and respond in moments. "Every movement we made was observed by their aircraft and engaged by their artillery," he wrote. That sentence reads like a confession and a diagnosis. The troops that invaded the Ardennes did so with the fog as ally, and found a technical clarity they could not counter. Questions multiply as the day lengthened into a week of blood. How does an army collapse in the face of guns that reach across forests and hit with the speed of thought? When do tactics pass into obsolescence? Can courage ever compensate for the absence of ammunition, roads and trucks? These were not theoretical questions to the German soldiers shivering in the snow. They were urgent and practical. Each decision to stay or to move, to attack or to hold, became a micro-trial whose consequences were life or death. The morning closed around the survivors like a ledger with too many blanks. Men counted the disappeared and rehearsed the near impossible. How could they fight when the ground itself conspired against them? They had been schooled to face the thunder of Soviet guns. They had not been taught the arithmetic of American industry, nor the quiet rooms where numbers were pre-solved and radio voices carried orders faster than a horse could run. As daylight failed and the cold settled its numb hand over bodies and weapons, a small pale speck crossed the sky. Some men mocked it, others spat, dismissive of what looked like a child's toy. None of them could have known that 3 minutes later, the field they stood upon would not look the same. The soldiers thought themselves survivors of the worst. They had yet to feel the new kind of terror that does not shout, but arrives with the precision of a verdict. What fell from that invisible calculus would force them to relearn how to die, or to live. A tiny unarmed plane drifted over a desert wadi, and minutes later an entire company ceased to exist. That absurd, almost comic image, a Piper L4 grasshopper, a child's toy in the sky, became a harbinger of death for men who had already learned how to die elsewhere. Otto Schmidt watched it and thought of nothing more than a recon flight. He would later count 11 survivors from a company of 123. The rest were blown apart in 30 seconds. You know the feeling when a small, ordinary thing suddenly changes everything? A single email arrives and your whole day shifts. A single notification on your phone starts a cascade. A meeting, a decision, a life altered by an automated chain you cannot see. That is how the Germans experienced the grasshopper. To them, it was a trivial bird overhead. To American artillery, it was a trigger, and behind that trigger stood a system that could turn one sighting into the violent answer of dozens of guns, coordinated and instantaneous. On other fronts, German soldiers had grown used to a pattern. Soviet barrages produced ranging shots, a rhythm that spoke to the trained ear. Seconds to move, a chance to survive in a shallow depression. Those rhythms shaped tactics and trust. Soldiers learned where to lie, when to crawl, and how to count the seconds between whistles and impact. Otto Schmidt, Friedrich Bauer, Hans Müller, men hardened by the Eastern North Africa, carried those habits like tools. In Tunis and Salerno, they trusted the language of explosives. It saved them once, twice. In the Ardennes, it betrayed them. The grasshopper itself had no weapons. It had a pilot and a view, a clarity of sight that radioed a map grid, a distance, a bearing. What followed was not random. Batteries at different ranges received that call and translated it into firing times. Shells that left several barrels at different moments arrived together over a single point. The result was not a rolling barrage, but a curtain dropped at once. Men had no time to react. Those who would have ducked and lived found the sky detonating above their heads, showering them with fragments from above, the worst possible alignment of physics against human reflex. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer read captured American documents and could not believe his eyes. Pages described procedures that seemed impossible. A centralized fire control that accepted a single observer's input and assigned firing solutions across multiple batteries. How could an artillery system move faster than the human observer's map? Yet Bauer watched it happen. Near Salerno, an American observer's sighting resulted in shells falling precisely on German gun emplacements before German crews had time to aim or even compute basic data for counterfire. Guns were silenced not by grand assaults, but by a kind of arithmetic applied to air and distance, calculation, coordination, and speed. The psychological effects were corrosive. When a soldier's long-trusted cues stop working, his mind invents new ones, often fear and hesitation. Orders that once landed with clarity now bounced off faces drained of confidence. Men argued, assault a position as ordered and be shredded by a precision barrage, or hold and risk being isolated and captured. Some units refused attacks, choosing the uncertain mercy of surrender over the near certainty of being cut apart in the open. The battlefield became a theater of moral arithmetic. Which death was preferable, which failure forgivable. These tactical choices echoed in personal, intimate terms. Imagine being told to cross a field to reach a barn 300 meters away. You can look at the snow, the hole you dug, measure your breath. You know the old trick, drop flat at the first bang. But now, voices drift overhead. A grasshopper passes, and you hear nothing until everything detonates. Men compared notes later in POW compounds with the same stunned, helpless cadence. We heard nothing. Then the world ended. The starkness of that phrase is not melodrama, it is the shape of trauma. There were practical horrors that compound the psychological ones. German guns were often horse-drawn. Crews needed time to limber and move. When American counterfire found them, they sometimes had no horses left, no time, no mobility. Batteries that should have shifted became immobile coffins. Ammunition shortages turned desperate. Where an American forward observer could call down the equivalent of a small airstrike in minutes, a German artilleryman might need hours of approval through headquarters to get corps support. That bureaucratic lag cost lives in the short term and morale over the long term. The contrast between a single small plane and the industrial network it represented is also a contrast we see in our own lives. One tiny sensor in a smart home can trigger dozens of automated devices, lights, locks, alarms, in a second. A single quick click orders goods from a warehouse that dispatches trucks and drones in a tightly timed ballet. The modern world's invisible coordination can solve problems. In war, when coordination is used to deliver destruction, it becomes a machine that removes human response from the equation. That asymmetry, the invisible algorithm versus human intuition, is at the core of what broke German expectations in 1943 and 1944. From the losers' perspective, these were bitter lessons. The men who survived carried them like wounds. They wrote in diaries the small, humiliating details, the way a comrade's face froze in the mid-crawl, the smell of scorched fleece, the way snow compacted into a blanket that turned red in minutes. Some tried to explain away their fear with technical anger. It was the radio, they said, or they had more guns. Others landed on the more corrosive truth, that the enemy had organized time and distance into a weapon the German army could not match. Conflicts inside units multiplied. Non-coms confronted commanders about the logic of orders. A lieutenant told historians about men who refused a suicidal advance because, from their recent memory, an enemy observer could convert that crossing into a death sentence. To obey or to survive, that binary forced men into moral acts that would later seed guilt and shame. In prison camps, questions turned inward. How could we have failed? Each soldier answered differently. Some blamed leadership. Some blamed the Reich's industrial collapse, some blamed fate. But almost all agreed on one point. The nature of artillery had changed, and with it, the meaning of survival. And still, the Grasshopper was only a part of the story. It symbolized a larger engine: radios, training, centralized planning, and the factories that built tools in vast numbers. German soldiers felt that engine like weather, relentless, impersonal, more powerful than any single man. They saw their world measured in minutes and miles, in convoys and assembly lines, and felt the smallness of their own bodies caught between those gears. If this makes you think about the small ways your own life can be rearranged by systems you do not see, you are already connecting with the core human truth behind these scenes. The men in the trenches learned it the worst way, with loss. If you want to keep walking through these voices, to hear what the survivors recorded in diaries and letters, to understand how calculation and industry made a new kind of killing machine, click the red button in the corner and subscribe. Join us as we continue to listen to the losing side, to understand how ordinary men were unmade by extraordinary systems. Your subscription helps us tell those stories in full. A night long after the Wadi, the men who remained sat under a bitter sky and tried to make sense of the math that had killed their friends. They began to look at the skies differently, to curse a plane that might yesterday have been dismissed as harmless. They learned to hate not only the metal that tore flesh, but the invisible order that made those metal pieces so deadly. The next revelation would not come from a pilot or a single battery, but from rooms where numbers were worked into answers before a shell was ever loaded, and from a doctrine that turned observation into a verdict. What was happening in that room, and why could it produce such quick, precise death across hundreds of kilometers? The question gnawed at them as the cold did. It would shape their decisions, their refusals, and the slow unraveling of an offensive that had begun with so much hope. They called it a fire direction center, a name as dry as an office memo. For the men in the foxholes, the FDC felt like a dark room at the center of a machine that had learned how to kill ahead of time. Where German batteries worked with pencil, slide rule, and a man's gut in the field, the American system carried the answers before the gunner ever touched his sight. In warm rooms far from the front, people, many of them women, sat at mechanical calculators and marchant machines and turned the slow art of ballistics into ready-made tables. These tables fit into a map case and into a soldier's hand, and they turned hours of field work into the few breaths between a report and a salvo. The tables were more than numbers, they were promises. Wind, temperature, humidity, cartridge lot differences, barrel wear. Everything that could nudge a shell off course had been measured, averaged, and printed into pocketbooks. A forward observer in a ditch could call a coordinate and a target description. The FDC would look up the pre-computed solution, adjust for the day's conditions, and send firing orders to dozen guns scattered across miles. Gunners who never met each other could, by following those orders, make their shells fall at the same place within seconds. For German soldiers who had once trusted the slow human rhythm of ranging shots, this looked like magic. For their officers, it looked like arithmetic given a face. Werner Hoffmann, a mathematics professor pressed into artillery service, later wrote that he had felt cheated by the efficiency itself. He could understand why the Americans had built such a system: industrial capacity, workforce, time for computation. But he could not reconcile it with the old German ideal of the artillery officer as artist and craftsman, someone whose eye and judgment decided the fate of a battery. The FDC reduced judgment to lookup, and in doing so, it made the battlefield less a contest of wits than a contest of preparation. German gunners could match skill for skill. They could not match the mass of pre-solved problems waiting in American map cases. Imagine being told to make a cake without a recipe, while your neighbor simply opens a package and in 20 minutes presents a perfect bake. That neighbor did not necessarily have more talent. He had the recipe printed and measured. The American FDC was a battlefield recipe box. For soldiers used to improvising, the sight of coordinated, pre-approved solutions arriving in minutes felt like betrayal. The enemy had not simply outgunned them, he had outordered them in knowledge itself. What would you do if the rules you practiced for years were quietly rewritten overnight? The human cost of that calculation was immediate. Batteries that fired once could be directed to produce counter-battery fire with extraordinary speed. An observer spotted a gun, the FDC solved correction tables, and multiple batteries fired a sequence designed to strike enemy guns simultaneously. German artillerymen who had spent years learning how to compute firing data now watched shells land on their emplacements before they had finished poverty-rough calculations on a cold map table. The American system did not need long-ranging fire or experimental shots. It used observation and pre-made math to cut that window out of the fight. In response, German crews often found themselves silenced, not by a grand tactical encirclement, but by minute, clean arithmetic. This mastery of time and space increased another darker dimension, the paralysis of decision. When a radio voice could summon the equivalent fire of dozens of batteries, any massing of infantry or armor became a beacon. German commanders had always weighed risk, but now their choices were binary and lethal. Keep troops concentrated and they would be shredded. Disperse them and they would be defeated piecemeal. For men who had believed in discipline and decisive maneuver, the new calculus demanded sacrifices that felt absurd. Break your formations into atoms to avoid being shattered, but then you lose the power to strike back. The FDC did not only fire shells, it forced choices that eroded morale. The process in the American FDC was almost bureaucratic in its thoroughness. Observers reported map coordinates by grid, clerks checked firing tables, supervisors adjusted for temperature and the propellant lot number. Orders were sent across clear FM channels to guns whose crews read numbers aloud and passed them quickly to the quadrant sites. In training, men practiced this choreography until their fingers knew the steps. The effect was to make each call for fire something like a small, rehearsed ritual rather than an improvisation. For German soldiers watching from their foxholes, this was not the sound of practiced bravery, but the chime of an efficient clock counting down. Can an army be defeated by a book of answers? The system's backbone was industrial. Pre-printed tables required labor, and factories far from any canon of battlefield glory. Large rooms in the United States filled with female clerks, their hands swift on calculators and typewriters, cranked out the solutions that would later fit into a sergeant's map case. It was a home front war fought with pencils and machines, and the implications were profound. The German war industry, strained by blockade and bombing, could not simply redirect manpower into such peaceful precision on the same scale. Where American industry could afford to compute and print solutions in bulk, Germany expended its intellectual capital on trying to keep guns moving and horses fed. The contrast was not merely a matter of guns on the line, but of nations organizing knowledge itself. In the field, men noticed other players in the system. The forward observer who understood infantry tactics as well as artillery procedure, the FM radios that cut through static, the motorized batteries that could change position in a half hour. These were small details with large effects. German forward observers were often artillery officers who lacked infantry training. American observers were soldiers who had been taught to think like both. That meant an American observer could spot a target, describe it with a clarity that mattered to a gunner, and do so in a way that the FDC could immediately use. It was a cultural difference as much as a technical one. The Americans had systematized the human component. These advantages multiplied and compounded. A single observer's report could bring into play divisional and corps artillery assigned for other tasks. The FDC could route and coordinate those fires rapidly. The result to the frontline soldier was terrifying. What looked like a small enemy force could summon, within minutes, a cloud of iron equal to an airstrike. The illusion of isolated opposition was gone. Every contact threatened to call down the wider weight of American resources. How do you fight an enemy who has already solved tomorrow's problems today? The psychological ripple found its way into simple acts. Soldiers spoke of a new kind of silence that preceded barrages, not the hush before a storm, but the clinical quiet of an office that has just pressed a button. Men whispered that the enemy's weapons were less instruments than verdicts. Diaries filled with sentences like these. We were killed by arithmetic. They had numbers for death. The language may sound abstract, but the images were concrete. Friends flung across snow, foxholes opened like mouths, horses buckled under the shock of shells. Behind each image lay the slow work of clerks and calculators, the ordinary labor that translated into extraordinary violence. The FDC did not remove all uncertainty. Weather still mattered. Radio lines could be cut. Human error remained possible. But the system reduced the fog of war more than German forces could counter. Where the Wehrmacht had once relied on individual initiative and rapid local decisions, it now faced a foe that had centralized a key part of combat power and made it remarkably reliable. For men who had built their identity on battlefield skill, the effect was to hollow out pride and replace it with a disorienting respect for an adversary whose strength felt mundane and implacable. German survivors later tried to explain this in simple terms to interrogators, historians, and friends. They spoke of rooms where numbers were solved as if by magic, of clerks who became weapons, of radios that turned sightings into simultaneous death. They were not merely correcting history. They were grappling with the way learning had been weaponized. Their anger mixed with a grudging admiration. Many conceded that their own doctrine had failed to keep pace. Others insisted that even with perfect planes and radios, the American system's scale would have decided the day. At the edge of any moral argument lies a human fact. Men on both sides died because other men, far from the front, had done their calculations and made different choices. The Fire Direction Center was not a villain in a story of good and evil. It was a method, neutral, efficient, devastating. But for those who lost sons and comrades in the snow of the Ardennes, method was a small, intolerable word for the machinery that had taken them. Their testimonies, stubborn and raw, ask us to look beyond heroics to the quiet rooms where the war's verdicts were written. They fired so all the shells landed at once that men never heard the warning. That silence, the absence of a single ranging shot, the impossible stillness before simultaneous fury, became, for many German soldiers, the last thing they remembered before the world ended. In the foxholes of the Ardennes, the technique called time on target revealed itself not as doctrine but as a moral test. German veterans who had survived Soviet barrages understood how to read a sky that spoke in whistles and jerky patterns. Time on target stole that voice. Batteries dozens of kilometers apart calculated different firing times so that shells, leaving individual tubes at staggered moments, struck the same map square within a 3-second window. The effect was not only physical destruction, it was psychological annihilation. A man who had trained his reflexes to a rhythm found the rhythm erased. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote with the dry accuracy of an accountant of death. It is not artillery as we understand it. You hear nothing. Then the world ends. How did they achieve such precision? The answer lay in layers. Pre-computed firing tables, practiced drill, the clarity of FM radio, trained forward observers, and the FDC's ability to marshal divisional and corps artillery within minutes. Radios mattered more than many men would admit. Where German communication still relied heavily on AM sets prone to static and on runners, American forward observers carried FM radios that cut interference and carried clear speech across the chaos. An observer's voice could be heard as a crisp sentence rather than a torn fragment. Those sentences were translated by the FDC into timed firing commands that traveled to batteries on roads cleared by motor transport. The human element made the system ruthless. American forward observers were not abstract technicians, they were soldiers who lived with the infantry. They knew how men moved, how they hid, what language to use to describe a target so the FDC could act without delay. German forward observers, often artillery officers with limited infantry experience, found themselves outmatched, not because they were less brave, but because they had been schooled in a different doctrine. The Americans trained the observer and the infantry together. They created a culture where calling for fire was as immediate and routine as calling for first aid. There were statistics that read like an accusation. During the Ardennes, 4,155 American guns fired approximately 1,255,000 rounds. A single forward observer could, at times, direct the equivalent weight of a small airstrike. The Germans discovered that concentration of men or armor became a beacon. If you massed troops, you could create decisive force, but you also created a target that American artillery could see, compute for, and strike with near-zero warning. For commanders, the paradox was brutal. Disperse and be defeated in detail. Concentrate and be shredded. Orders designed for maneuver in open ground became a moral and tactical trap. The doctrine that made time on target effective relied on preparation and logistics as much as tactics. Pre-computed tables removed time spent in manual calculations. Clerks in American offices had already solved variations for wind, temperature, cartridge lots, barrel wear, and altitude differences. Those tables slotted into map cases at the front and let an observer's simple call produce a firing solution in minutes. The soldier in the trench saw only the result, shells falling perfectly as if the enemy had an invisible hand on the clock. The math that saved time on one side became a sentence on the other. Then came the VT fuse, the technological insult that made shallow protective measures meaningless. The variable time fuse, a small radar transmitter and receiver packed into the nose of a shell, detected the ground and detonated at an optimal height, typically 10 to 20 meters above the earth. For men in shallow foxholes or lying flat in craters, this meant fragments would come down from above. What had saved lives on the Eastern Front, hugging the soil, now killed men who had thought themselves protected. Obergefreiter Hans Müller wrote in his diary that men who had survived Russian barrages by lying flat were cut down by fragments raining from overhead. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and we had no time to dig deep bunkers, he recorded. The VT fuse had proven itself at sea and in the defense of Britain. Naval tests in 1943 showed a VT fuse could shoot down aircraft with extraordinary economy, 2 or 3 salvos where conventional fuses might have failed. Against V-1 flying bombs over England, VT fuses destroyed roughly 79% of incoming targets. The lethal fragment area was radically larger, where conventional ground bursts produced a lethal area measured in tens of square feet. VT airbursts showered thousands of square feet. Estimates at the time suggested increases in artillery effectiveness on the order of several 100% when VT fuses were used. Yet for a long time, military planners hesitated to use them in Europe for fear of the technology falling into German hands. That fear was overridden by strategic necessity. When the Ardennes offensive began and German forces cut deep into Allied lines, General Dwight D. Eisenhower took the extraordinary step of requesting VT fuses for ground artillery. Permission came in mid-December, and by December 1921, VT fuses were being used against German formations in the Ardennes. The result was immediate and devastating. Men in the open who might have hunkered down and awaited a ground barrage found themselves struck by airbursts that came without warning. The psychological shock was tremendous. Soldiers who believed they had the old rules of survival felt betrayed by the ground itself. Industrial capacity made the weapon both lethal and persistent. The Americans produced thousands of howitzers, 8,536 M2A1 105mm howitzers, and 10,300 150 mm M1 guns during the war, numbers that Germany could not match. Motorized battalions meant that an American battery could limber, load onto trucks, move at highway speeds, and be ready to fire again in 20-30 minutes. German artillery remained largely dependent on horses. An artillery piece that took American crews half an hour to displace might take German horse teams several hours, and often far longer, in mud and winter cold. Germany started the war with 514,000 horses, and desperate for transport, ended with more than 1,198,000 by early 1945. Yet the horses could not match trucks on a highway or parry the logistical effect of Allied air interdiction. The result was stark on the battlefield. Batteries that had been vital a month earlier became immobile clustered targets. Ammunition shortages bit deep. German guns often had a ration of 2 to 3 shells a day in sustained operations. Some batteries in the Ardennes reported allocations as low as 50 shells per gun for an entire week. American guns, by contrast, fired without such restraint. The logistics of supply Trucks, depots, railheads kept open by air forces when weather allowed, fed an inexhaustible appetite for shells. The Americans could mass metal in a way the exhausted German economy could not. Psychology followed logistics. When men knew their guns were effectively silent because of lack of shells, when they saw enemy batteries place precise counterfire on their positions, morale slipped. Soldiers made choices that were moral as much as tactical: to stay and obey an order that would expose them to an annihilating barrage, or to disobey and risk court-martial but live. Some units refused to attack under those conditions, and commanders faced near mutinous refusal. The point at which obedience to orders clashed with the basic human instinct to survive was reached often during the Ardennes. There were other unexpected facts that compounded the horror. The effective lethality of a VT airburst meant that even small pockets of troops were dangerous to assault. A company pinned in a village could summon corps artillery that would make the streets into killing zones. One German commander recorded losing 400 men trying to overwhelm a fortified American company of 120, the defenders' artillery support and coordination more decisive than raw numbers. The German command structure compounded this by requiring multiple headquarters approvals to call up corps artillery. The result was delay. An American lieutenant could, with a single clear call, access divisional and corps fires. A German forward observer might have to route the request up through battalion and division, wasting essential hours. The arithmetic of production, doctrine, and technology thus became a strategic weapon. Between 1943 and 1945, the Allied industrial war effort produced vast quantities: tanks, trucks, guns, and shells in numbers Germany could not match. The artillery was only the most visible expression. Rock Island Arsenal and other factories channeled mass production into reliable, standardized parts and ammunition, simplifying logistics and enabling rapid resupply. Standardization mattered. The same fuse types, the same shell specifications across calibers, reduced complexity at the front. German logistics, by contrast, were burdened with varied calibers and multiple fuse types, producing chronic shortages of specific components, even when overall figures seemed reasonable. What did this feel like on the ground? Men recorded small scenes that confessed to a larger truth. The sound of a battery limbering up and driving away within 20 minutes after firing a mission became a bitter measure of American efficiency. German gunners, still reloading and adjusting sights, watched Americans set up in new positions and deliver accurate fire again before they could move. Diaries recorded horses shot dead, wagons burning, and lines of men on foot fleeing positions they could no longer hold. The physical exhaustion of dragging guns by hand after horses were killed, or abandoning them, added humiliation to the tactical disaster. By the end of the Ardennes campaign, the cumulative effect was clear. Units that began the offensive at full strength found themselves at 30–40% strength after mere weeks, and artillery accounted for the majority of losses. Oberst Heinrich Müller, writing from captivity, conceded that his regiment had been defeated more by American artillery than by tanks or infantry. "We were defeated by American artillery before we were defeated by American infantry or armor," he wrote. The artillery system had broken their will to mass, to maneuver, and to sustain an offensive. The aftermath left psychological scars beyond the physical ones. Survivors emigrated, carried nightmares, and the diaries they kept turned into small legal deposits of memory. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who survived TOT strikes, later moved to the United States, a bitter irony. The place whose weapons haunted his sleep became his refuge. In the long arc of military history, the Battle of the Bulge marked a turning point not merely in territory, but in doctrine. Time on target and the VT fuse did not invent massed fire, but they changed its character, making artillery an instrument that could, with industrial backing, dominate maneuver and shape strategy. Questions remain. Could the Germans have adapted quickly enough had they seen the writing sooner? Were there tactical responses that could have reduced the shock of airbursts and synchronized impacts? Some historians point to deeper structural problems: blockade, bombing, poor fuel and transport allocation, that made any quick adaptation impossible. Others note that once the Allies integrated air, artillery, intelligence and logistics into a coherent system, the battlefield itself changed shape. It favored those who could produce and organize as much as those who could fight. What endures is testimony from the losing side, the barren, simple sentences in diaries that name the technique of their undoing. "We were killed by arithmetic," one man wrote. "The numbers are cold, but the men were not. Their records push us to ask more than how many guns were built or how many shells fired. They push us to ask how modern war became a contest where calculation, logistics, and timing could unmake human bodies in the space of 3 seconds." The next part of this story will follow the surrender, the counting of losses, and the long reckoning that soldiers and nations had to make after the thunder quieted. When the guns finally fell silent and the snow began to thaw, the Germans who had pushed into the Ardennes were left with more than frozen bodies and broken guns. They carried a new knowledge, bitter and precise. They had been defeated not only by opposing soldiers, but by an entire way of making war, by calculation, industry, and coordinated time. Men like Obergefreiter Hans Müller and Otto Schmidt kept diaries that changed tone. Where once their pages held confident tactics and bitter jokes, now they recorded a slow, private admission. "We were outmatched in ways we had not understood." The numbers are stark and clinical, yet they helped shape a human verdict. During the Bulge, 4,155 American guns fired roughly 1,255,000 rounds. American industry had produced thousands of howitzers, over 8,500 of the M2A1 105mm and some 10,300 150 mm M1s, plus trucks, radios, and fuses, at a scale Germany could no longer match. For German soldiers, the scale was not an abstract statistic, but an experience. A battery firing without apparent restraint, while their own guns stayed silent for lack of shells. A forward observer speaking into a clear FM channel and seeing dozens of guns answer in minutes. The sudden merciless effect of VT fuses exploding above foxholes where men had believed the ground would save them. Those who survived often described a change in their inner life. Courage did not wither, it was reframed. Men who once believed that bravery and skill could overcome any opponent now felt their faith in that belief collapse under the weight of supply lines and clerical rooms. Werner Hoffmann, the mathematics professor turned artillery officer, wrote with a kind of sorrow that the Americans had done the math in advance. Franz Halder, once chief of the General Staff, later acknowledged a hard truth. The Allied artillery system turned a supporting arm into a dominant force. For German officers, this admission was not a technicality. It was a confession that their tradition of individual skill and improvisation could not substitute for massed production, standardization, and systematic training. The human consequences went beyond tactical loss. Men spoke of moral injury, the gnawing sense that their sacrifices had been met by an indifferent mechanism rather than a worthy contest. Some battalions refused orders they thought suicidal. Others obeyed and watched their ranks shredded in minutes. The choice between obedience and survival created inner fractures that did not heal with surrender. In prisoner of war camps, men compared their preconceptions to American reality. Many found the propaganda they had trusted, claims of American inferiority, of German martial superiority, to be false. Instead, they met professional enemies, factories humming, infrastructures that replaced losses, and soldiers who combined courage with overwhelming supply. That meeting changed stories and destinies. Officers like Oberst Heinrich Müller, writing from captivity, described how their formations were observed from the air and torn apart by artillery before tanks or infantry could decide an outcome. Lieutenant Werner Vogel and others noted the practical difference. An American lieutenant on the front could summon divisional or corps artillery with a clarity and speed that a German officer simply could not match because of doctrine and bureaucracy. The tactical gap reflected a deeper strategic reality. Germany's industry and logistics had been ground down by blockade and bombing. Horses multiplied as a desperate substitute for trucks. Production of shells and spare parts lagged behind need. Where Americans could fire thousands of shells a day, German batteries sometimes had only a handful to spend. Memory preserved smaller, searing images that textbooks cannot capture. A sergeant recorded the scream of a horse as a battery's last transport was struck. A young private wrote of his comrade's blank gaze after a TOT strike had changed the shape of his face. Kurt Zimmermann, who survived multiple time-on-target barrages, carried nightmares and later emigrated to the United States, an irony that shows the complexity of human response. These men did not simply lose a battle. They had to rearrange their moral map of who they were and what the world had become. After the war, German military professionals sifted through defeat, not to find scapegoats, but to learn. They spoke not with easy bitterness, but with analytic grief. Hoffmann's analysis of firing tables, Halder's recognition of systemic change, and countless reports from men who had been captured all agreed on a central point. Modern warfare had become industrial warfare. The capacity to organize knowledge, to produce and to supply, to train systematically, and to integrate communication and firepower mattered as much as individual valor. Artillery, once a supporting arm, had become an engine capable of deciding battles when paired with logistics and doctrine. This is a difficult lesson, and it is not only military. It is a lesson about systems and people, about how invisible infrastructures can shape destinies. For the soldiers who lost, the lesson was intimate. You can prepare your body and steel your will, but if your nation cannot feed your guns or your doctrine fails to match new forms of violence, courage alone will not save you. That thought follows survivors into the quiet years. Some became judges of a new order. Some emigrated to start again. Some kept silence. Many returned to fields once churned by shells and found the same landscape altered by memory more than by geography. We should reflect on these things not to lay blame on individual soldiers, but to understand how modern conflicts produce suffering in ways that hide behind numbers and logistics. The German testimony is valuable precisely because it strips away triumphal narrative and replaces it with human confession. In those confessions we find not only the mechanics of defeat, but the faces of men who learned painfully that systems can unmake human courage. They remind us that war's most decisive weapons are often not the guns pointed at a line, but the factories, the clerical rooms, the radios, and the doctrine that turns sighting into simultaneous death. If these accounts move you, consider what their meaning is for us today. Systems govern many parts of our lives. Healthcare, supply chains, communications. The same invisible architectures that can save lives can also, in other contexts, cause collapse. The testimony of men who lost in the Ardennes urges us to pay attention to how societies organize and to the human cost when systems fail or are weaponized. If you want to keep listening to these voices from the losing side, diaries, letters, reports that do not seek to excuse but to explain, please subscribe to the channel. Like this video if it made you think, and leave a comment below with your questions or personal reflections. If a memory is personal, you may share it anonymously. Many viewers find comfort and meaning in exchanges that honor lived experience. Your engagement helps preserve these stories and encourages a careful, humane conversation about the past. Join us and let these hard lessons guide how we think about systems, conflict, and the human cost of war.